Welcome to Safe Horizons virtual briefing on the topic of gun violence. Today's agenda, we're going to go over the scope and the impact of gun violence in New York City and the country. We're going to look at urgent calls for legislative measures and advocacy efforts that we as an organization are doing to protect victims and survivors. We're going to talk about increasing need for community-based support, and then how you as our community members can partner with us in this critical work. And finally, we'll move on to Q&A. The housekeeping is up on screen now. I'm going to leave that there for you to look through, and I'm just going to keep on moving forward. My name is Beck. I go by Beck. My name is Rebecca Pack. I'm the Director of Individual and Community Engagement here at Safe Horizon. That means I partner with individuals as well as community orgs to ensure that we have the resources we need to support survivors. I also oversee our junior board called Leaders on the Horizon, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. Okay, so we're going to hear less from me shortly and more from two of our experts. We have Kimmi Herring, who is the Associate VP of Community Programs at Safe Horizon, and Kimmi really is our gun violence expert on staff. And also you're going to hear from Jimmy Meagher, who is the Policy Director of Government Affairs. And you can see in that picture, Jimmy in action, advocating for the rights of survivors. Okay, let's start with, we have two audience poll questions that I'd love to start with. Can we launch the first one, please? Okay, so the first question is one that helps us learn a little bit about you and how you like to receive information. So can you let us know where you follow Safe Horizon when you're using social media? Do you use Instagram? Do you follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, or perhaps on LinkedIn? And then once you finish that question, there is a second question which you can access by scrolling down, and that's a true-false question. Does Safe Horizon exclusively work with victims and survivors of gun violence and domestic violence? So let's wait a minute. We've got those two questions. The first one is how you engage with us online, if at all. And the second is just to test your knowledge about Safe Horizons work. Okay. We'll just give that another minute. Now, you may be able to see other questions, but let's just focus on the first two for now, please. So which social media platforms do you follow us on? And true or false, does Safe Horizon work only with victims and survivors of domestic violence and gun violence? Okay, let's look at the top one. So it looks like more than half of you follow us on Instagram, woohoo, and LinkedIn. That is a place that we are starting to post more. So that's really exciting feedback. Thank you for telling us that Instagram and LinkedIn are the places that you engage with us the most online, as well as Twitter at 18% of participants and Facebook at 12%. And the second question we asked, everyone gets a gold star because it is false. Safe Horizon works with victims and survivors of many forms of violence and harm, not exclusively domestic violence and gun violence. Okay. I'm just going to minimize the poll. Okay, let's move on to the next part. a little bit about us. So you already knew that Safe Horizon doesn't exclusively work with victims and survivors of DV and gun violence. We're also here to support New Yorkers who have experienced family violence, assault, robbery, rape and sexual assault, stalking and harassment, identity theft, racism and hate crimes, exploitation and trafficking, sexual abuse of children, and physical abuse. We were founded in 1978. So as the organization has learned more about what our community needs and how we can best support them, our services have evolved, and they continue to evolve. And each year we work with about 250,000 New Yorkers. Our goal isn't to have contact with every single New Yorker, but our goal is for New Yorkers to know we are here, and we're here to help you move from crisis to confidence. And we do that from 150 locations across the 5 boroughs. And finally, we are led by Liz Roberts, who is our CEO. And Liz herself has a background in social work, and she really brings that lens of client-centered needs and focusing on the clients as their experts to all of our work and operations at Safe Horizon. Okay, so let's get into this important, meaty topic. Let's talk about gun violence. I am going to hand you over to Kimmi shortly. Kimmi is the Associate Vice President of Community Programs. She is our expert on gun violence, especially how it affects the families and communities who are affected by gun violence. She serves on the National Crime Victim Law Institute's Advisory Council and is a certified grief educator. And Kimmi's preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. Kimmi, I am going to turn it over to you.
You back. And thank you to all of you who are here joining us today for this much needed conversation. And I'd like to begin with sharing some details about the scope and impact of gun violence. And I'm going to start by saying this is a brief scope. There's so much that could be discussed and explored about the epidemic of gun violence. And I would imagine for each of you here today that it's really hard to ignore the barrage of news reports that plague our radio stations, newspapers, all sorts of media outlets with heartbreaking stories about mass violence, persons who have lost their lives to gun violence, people who have been injured. There's a far-reaching impact. And what we know is that every day, at least 120 people in America are killed due to gun violence. But the impact of that, right, is far beyond, and I don't want to minimize those 120 persons who have lost their life, but the impact of that is far greater than we can ever imagine. It is said that for every person who has lost their life, there are 8 to 10 people in close proximity to that person who are severely impacted. I'd ask all of you to think about this is not an issue that is a them issue, it's an us issue, right? We are all impacted in ways that we might not ever imagine, right? Gun violence homicides in the US are 26 times higher than in other developed countries, right? And so what does this mean? Children can't go to the park without their parents worrying. Those of us who attend synagogues, churches, other places of worship, it doesn't have the same sense of safety as it once did. Riding the subway may not have the same sense of safety. Sitting in our home, whether we own a weapon or not, we don't have the same sense of safety. So again, the impact of it is far-reaching. Guns exacerbate the power and control dynamic commonly used to inflict emotional abuse and exert coercive control. And what do I mean by that? For survivors and victims that we support at Safe Horizon, in which the harming party has access to a gun, the threat is even greater. A gun doesn't have to be discharged to cause harm, right? The mere fact that it is accessible to someone who is exerting power and control over another person elevates the psychological terror for that person, right? What we also know is that homicide is the leading cause of death among pregnant and postpartum women in the US. Boys and young men of color are most likely to be hurt or killed through the use of a gun. And again, it doesn't have to be fatal to have an emotional and psychological impact on those who are in the immediate environment. You don't have to be the direct victim. Persons who witness violence through the use of a gun can be just as traumatized as someone who has been injured or the surviving family who has lost a loved one to gun violence. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. And so now I'd like to talk about what our work looks like at Safe Horizon in terms of support and resources. At Safe Horizon, we help survivors, families, and communities impacted through gun violence in New York City. And I'd like to share some examples of what that looks like. In the terms of loss of life, family members or persons closely connected to the deceased person may come to us for support with financial assistance to bury the person who has lost their life to gun violence. Families may need to relocate as a result of the loss of life. There are times where it is gang involved. It could be an intra-family homicide. It could be domestic violence, and that person's safety is jeopardized in terms of their ability to stay living where the crime happened or in close proximity to persons who are responsible. And so we may be asked to help with relocation, to finance it, to help coordinate a move, to help find a new location for the person to live temporarily or long-term. It really varies, but we're here to, one, assess what the needs are and to provide the support that we can either directly through Safe Horizon or through our community partnerships. We support families. As I said, the impact of gun violence is far-reaching. Store owners who have endured robberies may come to us because now their livelihood is jeopardized, right? And so for them to understand what resources are available to them in the aftermath of a store robbery or a community itself. Oftentimes we are outreached by schools, by clergy to come in and partner with them to provide technical assistance or co-facilitate debriefings to help persons understand the common reactions that many of us have in the aftermath of violence. Emotional and psychological implications arise as a result of a singular incident of gun violence, and many people who we see live in communities where sadly gunshots are heard on a regular. And I just like to share with you, I had a recent experience in which I was doing a virtual intake and assessment with a family who was enduring an assault due to gang violence. And during my intake with this husband and wife, I heard this loud bang that I didn't recognize at first. I thought something had dropped in their home, only to hear the rapid succession of it while we were doing this intake. And so immediately I had to stop the intake and assess, were they physically safe? Which they were. The gunshots were not in their home, but they were so loud and clear, as I said, that I thought something fell in their home. And so I share this with you because oftentimes we hear these stories, and the way we cope with it is we externalize it. We think that, oh, I'm safe because it happened out there, or that certain things only happen to certain people. I was doing an intake. This family were meeting with me because they had endured an assault. They were safe, so they thought, in their home, only to have this experience of right outside their window, community violence involving gun violence. And this is important to note for many reasons, because there are times where people will come to Safe Horizon for support, and they're not the direct victim of it. But in an incident like that, someone might come to us and say, I need support to move. I cannot continue to live in my community. This happens on a regular. And oftentimes, when you look at the services that might be available, they wouldn't be considered a victim, right? Because there was no direct harm that happened to them that most people would consider them as a victim, but the psychological and emotional impact of that, right? And I was working with two adults. There's three minor children in their home. At Safe Horizon, we have the ability to support them, right? But we need funds to do it, right? And again, oftentimes the demand for the type of support that we offer is far greater than our ability to support it.
Kimmi, just
The
a
other
clarifying question. This is what you mean by undercounting victims, and this is why it's so hard for us to have concrete numbers, correct?
Correct. Because oftentimes when it comes to gun violence, people will think of the tragedy of it, right? The loss of life, or someone who has been impacted, injured, but survived, right? You think of it as primary victims. The undercounting comes in with what I'll say are those secondary victims, everyone else that is impacted in some way, short term, long term. And again, there's not necessarily enough resources and recognition to really understand the total impact of gun violence, right? And for those of us who live in communities where this happens on a regular, it becomes normalized, right? We're walking around impacted, traumatized, not recognizing that the reason that we're hypervigilant, looking around, not feeling safe in our own skin, jumpy, alert, right? Not able to focus. All of these things potentially are connected, right? You're in survival mode. And then for an adult to have these experiences, and sometimes we don't even have the ability to relate how our environment is impacting our daily functioning, much less a child who is caught up in this. And at Safe Horizon, we have various programs that have the ability to support children who are impacted by gun violence, whether it's they've lost a loved one, right, to gun violence, or they're living in a community where they're hearing gunshots on a norm. We have programs that have the ability to provide that child or children within that household the support that they need to manage the impact that they're experiencing, and hopefully to prevent PTSD. But if we have the ability to get to them soon after the incident that they've experienced, the hope is that the coping skills that we're able to support this child or children in learning, as well as their caregiver, can mitigate some of the more severe reactions that they might have. And then the other thing is that the violence is not always outside the home, right? In the earlier scope that I shared in terms of domestic violence, for many adults and children, the violence is within their home, right? And so many children have lost their life as a result of domestic violence. We know, again, and when I shared that women are 5 times greater to lose their life statistically through the use of a gun when domestic violence is within the family. And as we have heard in many stories, right, children have been a casualty as well. And so I just like to continue in terms of how do we help families. So there's financial assistance, there's counseling support. It's long-term, it's short-term. One of the greatest things that we offer is that our services aren't time limited, in that a person can come in when they're ready to receive support, they can cycle out and they can return. The other thing is that you don't have to be able to prove when coming to Safe Horizon that you are a victim through a police report or an order of protection. You can come into any of our client-facing programs and share your story. And we are here to support you based on the things that you are prioritizing. Our role is to be of support. We're not here to direct anyone to do something specific, but based on what you're sharing with us, we provide relevant information in the hope that you are able to make the best decision for you and those that you are responsible for. And our services are available to anyone, regardless of their immigration status.
Kimmi, can I ask you just one clarifying question? You
Sure.
mentioned that for someone to come to Safe Horizon asking for help, we remove the burden of a police report.
Correct.
Before I worked at Safe Horizon, I didn't really understand how that was a barrier. Could you go into that a little for us, please?
Well, for some, it's not safe to engage with the police. And I don't want to go into very nuanced details, but again, you hear stories, um, experiences that persons have had. And so it may not be in their best interest to engage with the police. Not all victims are believed, sadly, right? There's also that looming threat by a harm, and what I'm referring to in this moment is domestic violence, right? Um, Many of the survivors and victims that we have worked with share with us countless stories of how they've been threatened. You engage with the police, you let people know what's happening, and the threat of taking their life, or someone that they love taking their life. And so it can be a gamble, and there are many reasons, but I would stop there in saying that it's not as easy for some just to go and make a report, right? Then there are times where this report is needed. If you're filing for crime victim compensation, you must have a police report, right, to substantiate. And depending upon how the report is classified also determines what you might be eligible to receive. And so we have clients that again, it's important that we don't need the report to be able to engage with you. Right, but if you're asking for something tangible from another entity or system, that police report or an order of protection may be the document that is required to substantiate, what you've experienced and then what you hope to receive from that other entity.
That's really helpful, Kimmi. I just want to ask a question that I can see in the chat. Someone has asked about our services, specifically therapy, at no cost to the women who have experienced abuse, gang violence, gun violence. That is like a group of people we can absolutely help, correct?
Absolutely. We have many programs in which Safe Horizon, which all of the services are free of cost. We have a licensed mental health counseling center at Safe Horizon, which there is a fee for those who do not have insurance or do not currently have the finances to pay the cost for services. There's a sliding scale. We can also assess whether or not that person is eligible to apply for counseling compensation through New York State. But yes, to your question, we
Thank
can
you.
provide some level
And there
of
was a second part to that question about how someone can be referred to our program. At the end of the presentation, we're going to put up some hotlines and ways for folks who can contact us directly. But perhaps you can also share that information with me, and I can get it out to the audience via email as well.
Sure.
Yeah, how people can be referred into our programs.
Will do.
Thank you, Kimmi. Now we're going to switch gears a little. Safe Horizon, as you heard from Kimmi, provides services. We provide services that are really focused on what the client needs and what they prioritize, because they're the experts in their lives. But another part of the equation in addressing the issue and the impact of gun violence is, what are we doing on the policy side? And so for that part of the discussion, I'm going to introduce Jimmy Meagher. Jimmy is the policy director of our government affairs. He advocates on behalf of Safe Horizon for our budget and legislative priorities. He chairs New York City's Gender Justice Task Force and Denim Day in New York City. And he is a member of New York State's Office of Victim Services Advisory Council. And Jimmy's preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. Passing over to Jimmy.
Great. Thank you so much, Beck, and thank you all for joining us today. So like Beck said, my name is Jimmy Meagher, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I've been with Safe Horizon for over 15 years now. Previously did direct service work in our criminal justice programs, and now I've been in our government affairs office for several years. And as policy director, there are four main things, four main focuses to my work. It's really about coalition building, relationship building. It's about raising awareness about issues like the issue of gun violence, are advocating for our legislative priorities and advocating for our budget priorities. So Safe Horizon, we're the nation's largest victim services organization, but our programs are entirely based in the 5 boroughs of New York City. So most of our advocacy really is focused on New York City and on New York State, though we do some federal advocacy as well, especially around the Victims of Crime Act, budget advocacy, which I can get to in a little bit. But we only do a little bit of federal advocacy in coalition with many other state organizations, including the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, NYSCADIV and NYSCASA. So in terms of, so I'm going to start with raising awareness. So raising awareness around gun violence. Unfortunately, a lot of focus around gun violence and preventing it is at the federal level. And as you can imagine, not a lot of stuff is being done in Washington, D.C. these days. And the issue around gun violence is especially one of those contentious issues where it's difficult to find consensus. So one of the areas or one thing that we really engaged on recently was raising awareness about a case pending before the Supreme Court. This is the U.S. versus Rahimi case. In October, we hosted 2 different roundtables, one in Albany with Governor Kathy Hochul, alongside the New York State Office to Prevent Domestic Violence, OPDV, to just raise awareness about this case. And then we also had another roundtable in New York City that with our CEO, Liz Roberts, our Vice President of Criminal Justice Programs, Maureen Curtis, one of our clients who has been impacted by gun violence and domestic violence, as well as the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, and Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. What the Rahimi case is about, it's going to decide whether the federal law that currently prohibits a domestic violence abuser who has an order of protection against them to own or possess a firearm. This is really due to a change in the way that the current courts are looking at laws around gun violence, articulated by Supreme Court Justice Thomas, who basically said that any gun-related laws must have an historical analog to when those amendments were ratified. So our current federal law says that a domestic violence abuser who has an order of protection against them can't possess a firearm. And what some of the conservative members of the Supreme Court are saying is that, are there laws from like the late 1700s, early 1800s that are similar to that law? And of course not. Like in the 1700s, we weren't recognizing domestic violence. So that's kind of like the new thing that the Supreme Court is looking at. So this one person, Rahimi, is suing, basically saying that his right to own a firearm has been infringed upon, and that it's unconstitutional, even though he has a history of domestic violence, he has a history of gun violence. He actually, so he was prohibited from owning a firearm. He repeatedly violated that law, and he was convicted on, he was convicted, and now he's appealing his conviction on Second Amendment grounds. So we're really, really scared that the Supreme Court could overturn precedent and basically say that it's okay for that folks with a history of domestic violence should be able to own a firearm. And as Kimmi was talking about, that we see the intersections of gun violence and domestic violence and all these other forms of violence, that it's really, really dangerous for our clients and for other survivors across the country if that federal law is ruled unconstitutional. So we hosted these two roundtables to raise awareness about this issue, because I know sometimes it gets in the weeds when you hear about the Supreme Court. People say that's beyond that's beyond me. I don't really understand. So we were just trying to make it very, very personal and raising awareness so that people know that this is an issue facing at the Supreme Court right now. We're hopeful that the Supreme Court will decide the right way and say that that federal law is constitutional. It did seem from questioning during the Supreme Court case that there are many justices that are saying it does make sense for a domestic violence abuser to not have a firearm. So we're hopeful. We won't know the outcome of that case until the spring.
That was going to be one of my
summer.
questions. So thank you for preempting that. So we'll know next spring the outcome.
Yes, I don't know the exact timeline, but usually we find out all of the cases, the decisions by June-ish. So we'll learn more in like the late spring, early summer about that case.
How do you mentioned round tables for folks who aren't familiar with that concept, and like how that moves like the needle on policy or public opinion? Could you describe that a little?
Sure. So we want people to know about all of these issues that we see. So I mean, Safe Horizon, we have many, many different programs. Like Kimmi said, we work with survivors of all forms of violence. So we try to use our voice to just raise issues around child abuse, around gun violence, domestic violence, homelessness, the issues facing runaway and homeless youth, which is a population that our Street Work Project serves, just so that people know that there is I think people have lost a lot of faith in government. Um, and we want to let people know that that you do have power, you do have control. It's important to vote if you're able to vote in the states. That it's important to get involved, that it's important to know who your elected leaders are. That's at the city level, the state level, and at the federal level. Because if these are issues that you care about, you should be reaching out to your leaders in elected office to know that you care about these issues and that they need to be doing more on these issues. And there are other ways to get involved as well. We have many staff, we have many clients that are engaged in attending rallies, making their voices heard, attending protests and marches. That was something that we really were amplifying over the past many years around changing our immigration laws, around changing these laws that we think that would help prevent more acts of gun violence and mass casualty events. Like, America is very unique compared to other countries, that other countries, when something happens, they change the laws to make it harder for people to commit future acts of mass casualty, of mass violence. And America is unique in that regard, that we generally say there's nothing that we could do, but there's so much that we can do. And one way is to make sure that you know what your elected leaders are doing and vote. So I talked about awareness raising. I also just wanted to talk about the coalition building before I get into a little bit of legislative and budget advocacy. Safe Horizon, we sit on many different coalitions. In my introduction, of course, I chair the New York City Gender Justice Task Force and the Denim Day NYC Coalition, which hosts events during Rape and Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April. But we also sit on the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims, the Downstate Legislative Committee, the Downstate Racial Justice Committee. We also help with hosting the annual New York City Crime Victims Vigil. So there are so many different coalitions. So we're always trying to just build those relationships, because it's going to help with our legislative priorities and budget priorities if we have a good group of people that we're aligned in message, that we're aligned in energy, getting out there to really champion our priorities. And we also want to build relationships with lawmakers. It really is helpful for all of us. It's helpful for the lawmakers because they like to know that there's a program like Safe Horizon and other sibling organizations that are there for their constituents. That if they have a constituent that comes in and says, I was impacted by, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, or I need help, they know where they can connect that constituent to for further assistance and support. And we want to build our relationships just to, again, help amplify our priorities. Safe Horizon, we really believe that we know that safety looks different for every survivor, that healing looks different for every survivor, and that justice looks different for every survivor. So one of our values is really trying to expand the options for survivors and their families and their communities, so that they can really pursue safety, healing, and justice in the ways that feel right for them, which is one of our philosophies when we're doing our budget advocacy and our legislative advocacy. In terms of legislative advocacy, one example, so Kimmi talked about currently from the New York State Office of Victim Services, OVS, a victim of a crime needs a police report to qualify for compensation for expenses incurred because of that crime. Safe Horizon, we worked alongside New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and the Brady campaign, Common Justice, and the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence to get what is called the Fair Access to Victim Compensation Bill passed. And we had a lot of, and what that bill did or does, and spoiler alert, the governor just signed that bill into law on Friday, which is very, very exciting. What it will do is it extends the amount of time for those survivors that do want to report to law enforcement, because we're not saying you can't go to law enforcement. We're just trying to build out options for survivors who might not feel safe or comfortable going to law enforcement for all the reasons that Kimmi was talking about. So the law will extend the amount of time to report to law enforcement if you do choose to. It'll also extend the amount of time to file for OVS compensation. It's currently 1 year. It'll go to 3 years. And the bulk of the bill, what it will also do, it says that you don't need a police report or cooperation with law enforcement to qualify for crime victim compensation. What you could use instead is documentation from a victim service provider like Safe Horizon, from a medical provider or a mental health provider that can attest to the fact that this person was injured because of this crime that hasn't been reported to law enforcement. So the Fair Access to Victim Compensation Bill, it'll go into effect in 2 years in December 2025. So we're still celebrating the fact that it was signed into law on Friday. And now moving forward, we're really going to be working with our partners in state government to make sure that that law is implemented in the way that we think will be most beneficial for survivors. And then in terms of our budget advocacy, which is tied to this issue of gun violence, because what Safe Horizon, we're calling on our partners in city government, state government, and federal government is to invest in public safety. And when I say invest in public safety, we're talking about investing in those things that survivors are already asking for, investing in housing, investing in economic security, which is why this Fair Access to Victim Compensation Bill is so important to us, is that we want people to have the economic resources, the financial resources that they deserve, and investing in mental health care and all of the other things that are connected to public safety, in that when people feel that they have the resources that they need, it helps them heal moving forward. You know, people say hurt people, but also healed people heal people. That peace begets peace. So that if we believe that if survivors and their families, and also the people who have caused harm, have access to healing, have access to housing and economic opportunity, that we believe that gun violence will go down, and those other intersecting forms of violence will go down as well. Our big priority right now is really making sure that the state and the federal government also fix this looming issue over the victim services field. The programs across the country, one of the primary sources of money is from the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA. As part of VOCA, there's this Crime Victims Fund. The Crime Victims Fund funds the New York State Office of Victim Services and comparable. There's an organization like OVS in every state, and what those state agencies do is fund our programs. Safe Horizon, we receive money from OVS. Our sibling organizations receive money from OVS, and right now the money in the Crime Victims Fund has been declining. So we're very concerned that that's going to have ripple effects throughout the country. That as that pot of money goes down, that we won't have the resources, that New York State won't have the resources it needs to fund our programs, and we won't have the resources that we need to keep our programs open to support survivors. So we're working in coalition through that relationship building I was talking about to advocate at the state level for at least some state budget solutions, but also at the federal level as well, which really needs to happen as well. Again, working in partnership with agencies across the country, because this is going to be impacting every state. So that's a core part of our budget advocacy right now.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. And I think it doesn't immediately come to mind that things like investing in housing, economic security, and mental health services are immediately, that's not the thing that we necessarily assume will impact safety. So thank you for pointing those things out. So what we would really like to see, it sounds like, is investment at the front as much as possible rather than reacting, because at that point, the impact has happened.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, we want to be investing in prevention, as well as investing in the kind of the resources that survivors turn to after they've been impacted by violence. When we talk about ending the cycle of violence, of course, we're talking about ending the cycle of violence within a particular relationship, but also just the intergenerational cycles of violence that we also see as well.
Thank you. And Kimmi, I think, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to just circle back again and make one last comment on the far-reaching impact of gun violence. As Jimmy pointed out, as I did in a few of the examples that I gave, often we think about the direct victim, if you will, and I hate to say it that way, but just to distinguish someone who has lost their life and then someone who has been injured. And at Safe Horizon, we recognize all persons involved as victims. And so to give a clear example, any of us, let's say all of us are in the bank at the same time, and the bank is robbed, right? And all of us that are in this bank are held captive throughout the duration of this crime. If none of us sustain a physical injury, if none of us are kidnapped and removed from that bank by the armed robbers, right? None of us would qualify for crime victim compensation, right? We have not met the criteria of physical injury. We have not lost our life, but yet that experience in it of itself will likely have varying emotional and psychological impact on everyone that is involved. And so at Safe Horizon, we recognize, if that was a real situation, that everyone involved in that incident, whether you were in the bank, a caretaker, a parent to someone who was in that bank, we see you and recognize you as a victim of crime who might likely need to benefit from one of our services. And so finances, funding is essential for us to cast a wide net on who is understood to be a victim and have been impacted by a crime such as gun violence.
Thank you, Kimmi. And that example really illustrates the need that we have, the undercounting, the lack of resources, the need for more resources to support everyone who's been impacted.
Correct.
Thank you. Okay. We have just shy of 10 minutes left. So I want to ask the audience another question, and then we'll open the floor to you to ask some more questions. Could we get the poll up, please? So this is a question related to what Jimmy was talking about, but also Kimmi has now touched on. Are all victims of gun violence eligible for financial compensation? And this is a true, false question. Okay, so unfortunately, the answer is false. Not everyone who has been impacted is eligible for the financial compensation from those two pots of money that Jimmy was talking about, and that really is why it's so important for us to have support, so we are able to fill in gaps. Folks who have been impacted, folks who continue to be impacted by gun violence and other forms of violence. Okay, let's move on to, before we jump into the Q&A, could I have the slides up, please? Next one, please. Okay, so just really quickly, like there are, if you forget everything else I have personally said, please remember these 4 things. These are the ways that you can play an important role. And the first one is to donate, and to donate before December 31. Your financial contribution to Safe Horizon means that we can provide support to victims and survivors for their unique situation. Another way, number 2, you can become a monthly contributor to Safe Horizon, so we can keep pace with the impact of shootings and gun violence on New Yorkers. Number 3, we would love for you to engage with us on social media. We learned today that many of you are already engaging with us, especially on Instagram and LinkedIn. And you heard from Jimmy the importance of raising awareness and having conversations. If you follow us on social media, that is also where you can get information about our priorities, and you can support those priorities on our behalf. We are always looking for help amplifying our messages. And then that final one, and it feels very relevant at this time of year when we're having more family time, have conversations with the people that you love to raise awareness about this issue and other things that are important to you. Okay, so can we let's, just for the interest of time, let's just open up, because we've only got 5 minutes left. So again, I'm going to share this out afterwards. We have phone numbers, we have a smart chat, and we have Safe Horizon experts who are here to support you and others who have been impacted by gun violence and other forms of violence. We're going to put this all in an email. But because we only have 5 minutes left, I wanted to leave that to the audience. If anyone has questions, Ashley, I'm going to mute myself, and you can perhaps read out a question that you received in the chat.
So one question is, how do mass shootings differ from other types of gun violence?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the outreach and support. So many homicides occur right here in New York City that we never even hear about. They don't reach the media versus those that do, right? And so when mass shootings happen, there's usually a galvanizing of, criminal justice entities, social service entities that all pour in to that community for a period of time, right? And the attention is given to it. We could be right here in New York City, in Brooklyn, in Queens, in Staten Island, and you may be none the wiser that a family is suffering the loss of a loved one, or that they are in the hospital at rehab attending to their loved one who has suffered an injury. And so for me, I would say that's the major difference, the attention that is given to the different types of incidents and who is impacted.
Yeah, I would add that, I mean, for an incident of like a mass shooting, it's really terrorizing an entire community and terrorizes an entire country. Like we see I mean, unfortunately now I think we're each individually becoming more and more immune to these things because it's just happening every day. But I mean, it does ripple out throughout the entire community. I also just want to emphasize the fact that all these different forms of violence are interconnected, that in so many of these instances of a mass shooting, when you hear more about the person who committed the act of violence, that there's been a history of domestic violence, that there's been a history of child abuse. So, I mean, it's important that we recognize that we need to be doing so much more to prevent all of these forms of violence.
Thank you all. Another question is, what can be done to reduce gun violence?
So, I mean, we do need to change our laws, I would say, at the federal level. There are things that the city could do and that the state can do. I mean, sometimes it does feel like an uphill climb. The Supreme Court rolled back one of New York's firearms laws in the Brune case, which now led to this Rahimi case. So there are things that the city could do and that the state could do, but we're always concerned that then those laws could be rolled back by the Supreme Court, which at least this current Supreme Court and many members of Congress are really prioritizing gun rights over like our right to all live without fearing being a victim of a gun violence or losing our loved one to gun violence. In terms of what we could, the other ways that we could do it, this is why we emphasize the budget advocacy piece, is that if we could be building safer communities through investing in communities, investing in mental health and medical care, investing in housing, investing in making sure that people are living a living wage, like we support raising the minimum wage, that people are actually living a living wage, that if you that if we can get to really build a healthy society, a healthy community, we believe that it will reduce gun violence. The way that our society is structured in so many ways is that when people are left out of, feel like they're left out of the economy, left out of, kept from access to those mental health supports, that they might lean towards other, they might lean towards violence as it, for many, many different ways, including for survival.
And what I would add to what Jimmy said, the conversation needs to happen on all levels. Like, a child shouldn't be exempt, from engaging in conversation around conflict. Emotional intelligence is vitally important. So many young people are walking around with the weight of the world on them in terms of their own life experience. Not having the tools to manage difficult feelings, conflict amongst their peers. And so, again, I would add that, conversations at all levels. All right. No one is exempt from this issue, and no one should be excluded from the conversation. Of course, when dealing with children, we have to be mindful, and have age appropriate conversations. But when we're living in a world where a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old has access to a weapon and takes it to school and fires it at their teacher, it's clear that the conversation needs to start as early as possible, right? And working with managing those difficult feelings that little people are walking around having, right? And not having the tools to manage it appropriately and resulting, in loss of life or injury.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank
We
you.
have another question in the chat. It says Safe Horizon have
We're
support
just
groups
want
for
to flag that
survivors.
we're at time. So if folks need to leave, they can. But yeah, if you are able to stay, we would love to answer that final question.
So does Safe Horizon have support groups for survivors and secondary survivors of gun violence? And do you know of any in the city?
Currently, we do not have, at least within community programs, my team is not currently offering a support group for secondary survivors. However, it is something that we have offered, and it's something that we hope to resume in the near future. There are many community-based organizations in New York City that do offer various types of groups, some of which are the faith-based cure violence organizations, and then the hospital-based cure violence organizations also offer groups.
Great, thank you. We are at time, but if we didn't get to your question or your comment, we would absolutely like to answer that for you offline. So when you get that follow-up email from us, just reply to it. I also want to recognize that not everyone is on social media. So ways to have an impact, including raising awareness, we can also do that via email. So if you're not already on our emailing list, I encourage you to sign up. And that way you can stay informed and not have to be on social media. So thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Kimmi. And thank you, everyone who spent their Thursday morning with us. We hope it was educational, and we hope we've given you some tools and topics of conversation that you can have with your loved ones. Thank you.